Hello, everyone. We are very happy to have with us today Dr. Dibyadyuti Roy, who's joining us from University of Leeds. Today, he is going to talk about digital humanities and its significance and all the nuances that go into digital humanities being digital humanities. So I'm just going to share a brief introduction of Dr. Dibyadyuti and then we'll go ahead with it. So Dr. Dibyadyuti Roy is the current Vice President and founding member of India's first Digital Humanities Collective, the Digital Humanities Alliance for Research and Teaching Innovations, DHARTI, previously called Digital Humanities Alliance of India, DHAI, and he has spearheaded the inaugural DHAI conference in 2018, the first DHARTI Twitter conference, as well as the recently concluded DHARTI 2022 conference on the digital divides, discontents, debates, and discussions. Currently, he's a lecturer in cultural studies, media studies, and digital humanities at the University of Leeds, UK. With the experience of being a researcher and educator in multidisciplinary academic environments across 3 different continents, his teaching and scholarship facilitates public and cultural policymaking by putting data-driven knowledge into collaboration and friction with interpretive and exploratory humanistic inquiry. Welcome, Dr. Dibyadyuti. We are really honored and privileged to have you here. And hello to Dr. Akash Raha, my fellow colleague. So over to you, Dr. Dibyadyuti. We would want you to start, and then we'll have a series of questions.
Thanks so much, Dr. Sakshi, and thanks, Dr. Raha. And I'll just call you Sakshi and Akash, and please call me Dibya.
Yes, please.
Again, I very much appreciate the kind introduction, but I should start off by saying, organizing a conference yourselves, you must realize that every act of doing a conference or any kind of academic inquiry is always collaborative. So while I have been privileged to have created these conversations for Indian DH, it has always been a collaborative activity. So with that, I start off I'll start sharing screen. Let me know if you're able to see my screen, if there's any issues.
Yeah.
And perfect. Thanks so much. So, right. So, going into the conversation, having had this conversation with you for a couple of sessions or a couple of meetings, I thought it would be only fair to talk about the ontologies of DH. What is the being of DH in or from majority words? And I've already been introduced, so I won't spend a lot of time there. I want to first start by congratulating University of Petroleum and Energy Studies for organizing Intersections, the International Conference on Digital Humanities on December 15th and 16th. Unfortunately, I won't be in India at that point of time. Otherwise, I would have definitely been there. But we have the affordances of the digital platforms to be in conversation at least. So again, hearty congratulations to Professor Shubhashish Gangopadhyay, Dean of UPES, Dr. Akash Raha, Dr. Sakshi Chanana, for playing such an integral role. As I was mentioning to Sakshi and Akash just a little while ago, that any act of digital humanities in majority worlds or in the global south, as it is known as, is always a collaborative act. DH we talked about in terms of research, but it also needs to be talked about in terms of teaching. And very importantly, DH needs to be talked about in terms of community building in global south majority world spaces. And I see the conference reflecting that kind of a community conversation. And for example, the 4 years that DHARTI has been in existence, and before that we were DHAI, this act of collaboration has kept alive the conversation. So I congratulate UPES and the entire team for putting up this fabulous effort. But having said that, let me also point out that what do I mean by majority worlds and why do I say it all the time, right? This term majority worlds is a term that's framed by the Bangladeshi photographer Shahidul Alam, who in 2008 coined this term majority world by saying that, why call ourselves the global south or the third world when in fact majority of the world's population live in our parts of the world that we come from. And that's why it's very important to talk, before we talk of DH, we talk of DH in many registers, but the most important register is context. And that's what I wanted to start off with. saying that it's very important to talk about DH in its specific context. And without context, there is no conversation around DH. And therefore, as you can see, the term majority world defines the community in terms of what it has rather than what it lacks. In time, the majority world will reaffirm its place in a world where the earth will again belong to the people who walk on it. This is simply to say that when you have localized DH conversations, those conversations are as relevant and as important to global DH as is global DH's major conversations on normative structures. So I think every community has something to offer to conversations around DH. So it should not be a top-down process at all. It must be a dialogic process. And by dialogic, I mean, what is DH dialogue? DH dialogue goes back to the etymology of the root of the word dialogue. Dia meaning through and logos meaning reasoning. So through reasoning, through acts of reasoning, through acts of structure, through factual conversations, we create these narratives of local DH. We have our limitations, we have our specificities, but we also have our strengths as a community. And this is a word that will come up over and over again. And I'm so really happy to see that UPS is kind of harboring or kind of consolidating the power of the community at their institution and getting together number of academics. And I know a lot of my 30 colleagues are also speaking at intersections, which is great to see and wonderful to keep the conversations going. So without further ado, I'll now move on to what I see as I'm going to just kind of reduce the floating heads to a little bit so that I can see my PowerPoint slides. Yeah, great. So I'm going to start off today with something that's a little more originary, which is that you see these conversations around DH, and this is sort of this slide is a representation of this famous big tent metaphor in digital humanities. And as you know, some of you might already know this, that digital humanities is the term is new, but the conversations around digital humanities have been there since the early 20th century as humanities computing, when Father Roberto Busa started a concordance with St. Thomas of Aquinas's works. And since then, humanities computing has happened in various registers, even in India. Sort of computational linguistics has been a very strong uh, proponent of what we understand to be digital humanities now. The word digital humanities, or the term digital humanities, is a far more recent term and came out in late 2000s, around 2010, if I'm not mistaken. And we have this famous essay from DH scholar Stephen Ramsey, who talks of digital humanities as a big tent that includes everyone, all kinds of conversation around DH. Okay. And as you can see represented on screen, since then, we've had various scholars coming together talking of digital humanities across different humanistic and social scientific disciplines. In fact, there's this, so it's almost a genre. What is digital humanities? And, kind of defining the big tent. But how I come to this conversation is maybe an extrapolation, or rather kind of just taking myself a little outside the conversation and saying, what if you don't even know there's a tent? What if you don't know there's a tent? And for example, Professor Melissa Terras talks about peering inside the big tent, which still means that you're ontologically aware. The being of a big tent is still known to you. But what if you're not even aware of that ontology? What if that big tent is not something that you know about? Are you still allowed to be a digital humanist? And that's something what I'll be operationalizing through my talk today. I'll try to keep it a little limited so that we can have time for conversations. So again, as you know, every discipline creates the conversations around itself through a dialogue between the ontology of the discipline and the epistemology of the discipline, being between the being and the becoming of the discipline. This is a dialogue. This is a dialogue that keeps happening, and it's self-reflexive. It keeps on informing each other in their conversations. However, as you might have noticed in the kind of articles that I put up in the previous slide, these conversations around digital humanities have largely focused on epistemology, or how we know what we know. And these questions have been limited to questions around where are DH departments located, how do we research, teach, and practice digital humanities. In fact, the well-known series, Debates in Digital Humanities, where I also have publications, both current and forthcoming. It's an entire definitional genre about where we talk about these debates in digital humanities. But as you can understand, these debates in digital humanities are largely epistemology focused. So we focus on epistemes, we focus on knowledge structures, but we take for granted those knowledge structures, and we often don't talk about the ontology. By ontology, what do I mean? I mean, why is digital humanities required? So the being of digital humanities, and what are the conditions behind the existence of digital humanities? And this is the fundamental question, which is, I'm not saying it's not talked about, but this is the minority of the conversation. It isn't talked about to the extent that it should be talked about, and especially in the Indian context. And this is something that I keep writing about, and I've written multiple times. And I'm using a Deleuzian and Guattarian metaphor here. Indian DH is like a rhizome. It's like fungus, it's like ginger, it's like galangal. There is no primary root that where it starts from. It starts from various places. It begins with various origins. So if I have to use a Marvel example, we don't have one origin story. We have a multiverse of origin stories, right? And we need to acknowledge all these rhizomes. And this rhizome metaphor basically amplifies the lack of an academic, institutional, or structural focal point for DH. And I'm so happy that UPES is using that rhizomatic metaphor to its advantage by bringing together a host of scholars from across the world, but also most importantly from different places in India, which actually allow that conversation of the rhizome to be materialized, that any point can be connected to anything and must be very different from the tree or root, which plots a point, fixes an order. So the normative structures of Anglo-American DH cannot be understood as the origins or creating the teleology of DH for India. Therefore, that's something that I want to kind of establish or emphasize at the beginning of this conversation. And what is the ecosystem of this rhizomatic DH in India? This ecosystem is always something that exists in conversation with our colonial legacies, the intersectional privileges of caste, class, gender, and many other such categories, as well as the specific technological affordances or limitations that create the social imaginary of the humanities. For example, humanities in India wasn't created to produce original research. It was created to serve the imperial overlords. And I do want to acknowledge a fantastic scholar here, Professor Shoykot Mojumdar, who teaches at Ashoka. And he's got this book called College Pathways of Possibility, where he actually traces this root of the colonial education. It starts off with 1835, Macaulay's Minute on Indian Education. And therefore, the social imaginary of the humanities in India has largely been constrained as not being original research, which has been constantly, there's a pushback in post-colonial times, but that's the social imaginary of the humanities largely. And of course, now we have the post-COVID-19 landscape and neoliberal structures. And therefore, the humanities always is asked to be functionalist. And I do not come to this conversation today to legitimize digital humanities in any way. I do not come here to validate digital humanities in any way. I'm here to talk about why digital humanities emerges organically from the structures and the lived experiences of our people and people across the world as a whole. I do want to point out that this is something that's not talked about enough, that in India, digital humanities has been able to bring out the intrinsic relationship between academia and the glam sector, galleries, libraries, archives, museums. And that's something that thankfully digital humanities has brought out. It still needs a lot of work. In fact, I do want to mention quite a few collectives along with Dharti, like Milli. Milli is the archives consortium that emerged out of Venkat Srinivasan, who's the chief archivist at National Center for Biological Sciences. Venkat's doing fabulous work with many other colleagues. There's Tattle, organization like Tattle, which is run by, which is co-founded by Tarunima Prabhakar. I think Tarunima is also coming for the conference. There's also organizations like Electronic Literature India. There's organizations like Digra India, started by Professor Shobhik Mukherjee, a fantastic game study scholar. And these are all scholars who contribute to that rhizomatic Indian DH landscape. So just to kind of summarize that conversation, that it's not in one institution, it's not in only UPES, or not just in one IIT, IIM, or one institution, but it's all of these conversations coming together and not trying to form an organic whole, not trying to form a meta narrative of any sort for the Indian DH, but rather acknowledging all those specificities, limitations, structuration. So that's something I want to bring and emphasize at the beginning of today's conversation. I do want to start out with this idea of digital, and then try to kind of break it down. So the word digital actually comes from the common digital extensor. So that this muscle that connects our 5 digits, right? So communist means common digital extensor. This is the extensor muscle that all 5 digits have in common. And the conversation goes that our 5 digits do what index fingers do. So basically, digits, by which I mean binary digits, 0 and 1, do what index fingers do, namely count, point, and manipulate. So Kyle Hyman says that ever since we evolved extensor digitorum muscles, which was about 10,000 years ago, ours has literally been a digital condition. So this is not something that's new. The act of being digital is not new. And more importantly, the word digital itself has gone through a life cycle of change. So if you looked at first century BC, digitus would be finger and toe, and counting with our fingers connects us to late 14th century, where digit is any numeral below 10. And then we move to from analog digits to electronic digits, right? So-called analog, and I'll come to this analog digital divide, or so-called divide as well. We move from analog digits to electronic digits with 1942, the first digital computer, named after the digits, the binary that was used in processing. And then again, this is a very impersonal computer. These are huge technological infrastructures that are not available to everyone. They are impersonal. So then these impersonal computers become very personal. And right now we have haptic mediums and the tactility of digital computers. So we've again got back to this kind of indexing, the counting, manipulating, and the pointing with the finger itself, with the digit. So then today's digital computers are returning back to the original meaning of the digital. What does this do for us? It tells us that the analog and the digital are not in binary opposition to each other. In fact, both of them index the real approximately, and they do so non-exclusively. So this kind of binary between the analog and the digital is a created binary. Because in fact, even if you think about things like stylometry, where you try to understand the ways word composition works, the writer's styles. The first kind of stylometry article, if you think about it, was T.C. Mendenhall's 1887 essay, The Characteristic Word Curves of Composition, where he did this kind of what we understand now to be stylometry. But the point is that this kind of division between the analog and the digital is quite constructed. It is not something that is there. So I do not believe that being a digital humanist requires you to go out of your analog humanist structure. The conversation is focused here around the humanities, around being a humanist as well as being a social scientist. So that's something I do want to kind of emphasize here. But to begin, let's look at computing as the humanities, which has been, and this is from the fabulous scholarship of Jeffrey Rockwell, who actually points out how computing as the humanities is existing for a very long time at the intersection of various humanities and social sciences disciplines: political science, history, English, media studies, art, languages, linguistics, philosophy. And some of those intersections are maybe more known to you. For example, English has, or literary studies has had bibliography and editorial studies. Literary theory, cultural studies, game studies have always been at the intersections between media studies and English, and all of them interact with computing through new media, imaging, human-computer interaction, HCI, hypertext theory. And then with linguistics, in fact, computational linguistics, or CALL, computer assisting language learning, has always been a very integral part of computing as the humanities. So when we have this rise of what we understand to be the episteme of digital humanities, late 2010 onward, there's this fabulous Digital Humanities Manifesto 2.0 from Schnapp. And one of them is, of course, decrying the stability or the power of the print media or the print culture as the only site of conversation for the humanities. If humanities is about creating conversations about humans, about questioning normative structures, then it can never be only focused on just the print media. For example, if I give you a quick example, there's about 120, 130 million books in the world right now. If you combine Library of Congress, if you combine the Chinese library, the British library, but there's by 2020 data, there's about 1.5 billion websites in the world. And that's not to create a binary again, but just to say, as much as 130 million books, some of them well written, some of them not so well written, are important about conversations in the humanities and social sciences, so are 1.5 billion websites. So we have to encourage that the ecosystem of humanities and social scientific knowledge is not limited to the print culture only. And therefore, what we need to understand is to deconstruct this binary and actually think of these sites of knowledge as platforms. And what kinds of platforms does digital humanities contend with? Digital humanities contends with data in or for at least three types, at least. This is not a complete list, but platforms where data is presumed or produced and consumed. This is, of course, Henry Jenkins's conversation around convergence culture and participatory learning, participatory cultures. For example, social media, new media, where you're producing and consuming data at the same time. Second would be platforms where cultures of multimodal data are expressed. For example, computer games or websites, for that matter of fact, right? Where our cultures, our specificities of culture are produced through multimodal data, not just text, but through visuals, through audio. For example, Twitter, one of the bigger, kind of logic of Twitter is you can now, Twitter is, of course, under a lot of controversy, but anything that's like Twitter, Mastodon, however you want to talk about it. The third would be platforms where we archive or publish data. So, in a sense, this is the three sites of for the digital humanities, at least. And this is where I actually want to go into my next question, which is who is a digital humanist? Because if these are the platforms, then who is the digital humanist? So, the digital humanities has been having these genre conversations definitional, but it's been less talked about that who is allowed to be a digital humanist or who is a digital humanist. So in a sense, if you think about the production and consumption of data, that would involve largely if you're trying to work with data from these production and consumption sites. For example, if you look at YouTube and you want to kind of scrape all the comments from YouTube and try to understand both the context in which the video is produced as well as how it is being received, you do have your research question. The origin of the research question is in a computational medium. That's why the ontology of your question matters so much. And therefore, at that point of time, the digital humanist would be a computational humanist for whom computational technology has become the very condition required to think about the questions raised in the humanities today. So, if you just sort of moving on in that circle, if you come to the multimodal scholar who analyzes visual, oral, dynamic, and interactive media, for example, games, interactive fiction, electronic literature, this is mostly where the cultural studies, the literary studies scholar finds an easy movement because you're still using a critical framework, but through different multi-modes. And finally, but definitely not the least, is the digital archivist who purposefully selects online groupings of digital copies of non-digital original materials in order to support a scholarly goal. And this is where the digital humanist probably differs from the archivist or the analog archivist, where analog archivists always do not create collections to meet a purposeful scholarly goal. So this is from Kate Themer's fabulous essay, Archives in Context and as Context. But I also do want to point out that you can see all of these conversations connected together, which means you do not exist in isolation. For example, today, while you're analyzing that YouTube video, I'll use that example because I start out with that. So for example, if you as a computational humanist, you're trying to understand the kind of surroundings in which a particular video, say about gender, is received in India, you also look at the kind of background from which the context of production as well as the effect of that production. So in a way, you are both working at the computational humanist and as a multimodal cultural scholar. And finally, if you decide to archive that video for further conversations, to encourage further conversation in the future, you move into this idea of the digital archive. So in a sense, And why I say this, because I've been fortunate enough to be part of all three paradigms in digital humanities, and I see this being very organic, a connection that is really not a forced one. And just to tell you of, when we talk of data, this is, we are dealing with humanistic data. There is no such thing as raw data. And I'm quoting Tarunima here in one of her articles. I think it is published on Medium. She talks about there is no such thing as raw data, because data, and most importantly, data is an asset owned by the people who produce it. Production and ownership of data are inextricably linked, and we should not speak of one without the other. So the political economy of data is a very important part of digital humanities and must be talked about. And methodologically, it's very important to understand this political economy of data. And a lot of people ask me, right, should we go for, closed reading, or should we go for distant reading? Distant reading and cultural analytics is two of the large methodological structures of digital humanities. My answer is always, it depends on your research question. If your research question requires you to do distant reading, you do that. If it requires a mixed methods approach, you do that. But your research question always determines your methodology. And methodology, closed reading is a methodology, as I pointed out here. More importantly, we also need to remember that data and capta are always in conversation with each other. So capta is taken actively, while data is assumed to be a given, able to be recorded and observed. Humanistic inquiry acknowledges the situated, partial, and constitutive character of knowledge production, the recognition that knowledge is constructed, taken, not simply given. And I think part of being a qualitative researcher is often that the human body becomes an embodied site as an instrument. I'm not saying instrumentalizing the human body, but rather that it's a self-reflexive relation between you, the humanities researcher, and the humanistic data that we pick up. I do want to point out this fabulous white paper from the Alan Turing Institute, which was released in 2020, a white paper that talks about the challenges and prospects of the intersection of humanities and data science, where they say that building on the strong traditions of interdisciplinarity and intramural collaboration, which has characterized the field of digital humanities, we need strong models of collaboration. Without such collaborations, there is substantial risk that data-driven research does not say anything new or meaningful, repeats well-known distortions, or introduces new forms of bias at an even larger scale. And this is why we need digital humanities. This is why we need digital humanities, because it's a collaborative side that can question the data-driven epistemologies that are kind of dominating our world right now. The opacity of algorithms, which Jenna Burrell talks about, and that's something that needs to be challenged. These things need to be challenged. As humanistic scholars, we have a stake in this, because algorithms run our lives. So we should be allowed to have a part in this conversation. I'll come to this a little bit later. As you may understand, I work in algorithmic bias and algorithmic accountability right now. So this is something that I feel very strongly about. Just wanted to kind of tell you a little bit about my kind of, this is not all inclusive, but some of the works that I've done in my roles as a digital humanist. For example, 2021, I looked at social media health promotion in India during the COVID-19 crisis in my role as a computational humanist. I've looked at post-colonial pregnancies in neoliberal times by analyzing advertisements, which required me both to be a computational humanist as well as a multimodal cultural scholar. My work with game studies have largely been about being a multimodal cultural scholar, which came out last year in Gender, Place, and Culture. This year, I have had another publication on Pokemon Go as one of a hybrid habitat of sorts. And this is an older publication, but it comes from my own PhD work on minority nuclear cultures. And this has required me to become a digital archivist, where I'm trying to collaboratively create a community-oriented archive of nuclear cultures. So that's something that allows me to go into all three roles of being a digital humanist. Along with that, of course, I also do quite a bit of work in terms of digital humanities as a whole, kind of an overview. So this is the most recent I published with Nirmala. I think Nirmala is coming for the conference as well. In the global debates, the digital humanities, I also have publications in the series that's coming out on pedagogy, as well as the series that's coming out of community in DH in the next year or so. Also another publication that's coming out from the Center for Digital Humanities in Pune on introductory pedagogical text to digital humanities, as well as this fantastic special issue that in this journal that's run by Jennifer Gilano and Rupika Risam on reviews in digital humanities, where I did a special issue with Amanda and Schuyler on the idea of what are digital humanities projects and how can they be used pedagogically. That's a very important part of the conversation. I just want to briefly mention here my kind of work with algorithms and kind of projects, because in digital humanities, projects are given a lot of importance. So of course, I do have quite a few projects, and most of these projects, I collaborate with Data and Society Research Institute in the US quite a bit. I was one of the 5 experts in the 2020 project on parables of AI in and from the majority world, which has just come out as an anthology. And I'm very happy to know there's the Dharti executive committee member Vasundhara Dahiya has a publication in this anthology. I've also been working on the idea of how does art get interpreted through algorithmic interpretations versus affective imaginations. This is a project that I just finished with the British Council, which is under their heading Museum Without Walls 2.0, which is about decolonizing art for all countries that have not been able to access these forms of art. And this is the current project I'm working on with two student colleagues from India, Lavanya and Vasundhara, on digital dating, masculinity, and consent, which emerged out of the social life of algorithmic harms workshop. Just to point out the kind of work in terms of projects that I'm putting forward. I do want to here quickly acknowledge the fact that because I know the School of Liberal Studies at UPES will try to have a core course in digital humanities, this is something that I find very, very important, that we have to acknowledge the axis between digitality and the humanities, which is where our courses should, or courses, modules, however you put it, should be focused on. So you need to know your research narrative, right? So on one end of the axis, as you can see on the x-axis, it's a focus on technical development. And on the other side of the x-axis, there's theoretical understanding. And on the y-axis, on one end, it's digitality as a tool of study, right? And on the other example is digitality as a subject of study. So digitality in this context, how I define digitality or post-colonial digitality, is the realization of digital affordances in specific context, specifically the post-colonial context. So for example, if you do a digital humanities course at UPES and there's a research project or a final project for students, at the end of the module or course, these are some of the questions that I would ask ask the students, and I will expect these questions to drive their projects. So after you have the basic purpose noted down, think about how much data you need. Some projects need only small amount of data, while others may need significantly larger amounts. Check your assumptions about the platform and its affordances that will be used to develop your project. So think about what kind of platforms are you using? What are its affordances? Is your data reliable? Is your platform open source? Is this digital space user entered or mediated from another platform or technology? And with Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn, you can see the conversations around APIs, application programming interfaces, which allow you to have conversations between two software. Is that an open API based platform? Think about these questions. Think about how you will query and analyze your data, the critical methodological framework. This is vitally important. I cannot emphasize enough how important that it is. And then is your project going to help or facilitate for the end user reader who can continue interpreting your data narrative? So it's not a closed project. It's an open world that you're creating. So, and does your reader or end audience also fully understand the limitations of your data? Is your data narrative sustainable, especially, right? So does it create sustainability, contribute to the SDG goals of the UN? In sort of conclusion in here, we can talk about digital humanities projects having three main kind of structures, and I'm happy to of course go into the conversation. If you have narrative, if you have visuals, you have data, if you combine all three of them, the three things you're trying to do are engage, explain, enlighten, and hopefully lead to some kind of humanistic change in the particular area or focus that you've picked up. Some of the projects that have come from my own courses on digital humanities, and I work at the intersections of many disciplines and digital humanities, but I'm very proud of these kind of projects that have come up, and particularly I'm proud of the students who've done this, and I take my students as collaborators and partners, So in kind of these conversations, so I do not expect that it's a pedagogic process where I come and teach, but rather it's a dialogic process of learning. Just to go back, because I'm about to conclude now, just to point out that why I recognize the amazing work that UPS is doing is because, having done these conferences part 3 times at least for Dharti and I recognize how difficult and how important this is. So in 2018, when IIT Indore and IIM Indore jointly decided to hold the conference at IIM Indore. And of course, I'm sure Nirmala will also speak about it because she was the conference co-organizer with me. That we did not expect a lot. We thought that let's have an open CFP based conference. There were previously digital humanities conference based in the country, but they were not open CFP based. So let's have an open CFP based conference. And we were absolutely surprised, astonished, pleasantly that we got over 70 submissions and had participation from 15 Indian states and 5 countries. That led us to kind of taking forward DHAI, Digital Humanities Alliance of India, into Dharti, which is a little more open in its way it looks at DH across the world. We also did the first Twitter conference, as Sakshi has pointed out. Since then, we've done this series called Dharti Speaks, which is on YouTube. And this year, we hope to take it forward through podcasts. That's what our plan is, to take this forward in podcasts. And many of, I think, my student colleagues will also be joining the conference. So it will be good to know later what their thoughts are. Early this year in February, we organized the digital the second conference of Dharti, but the third kind of Dhai Dharti conference, which talked about digital divides. And that's something extremely important. We talked about the discontents, debates, and discussions. Again, 50 papers, 15 posters, 4 keynotes, fabulous workshops. And I must here acknowledge Professor Arjun Ghosh from IIT Delhi, who was the conference co-organizer chairing this with me, and the fabulous team of scholars from different institutions across India who contributed to making this work. It was not just a single person or 2 people, it was a collaboration, and it was very successful, and I'm very proud that this exists. Hopefully we'll be able to put out all the conversations online in quick time. So just to end, I'm right now part of the Intersectional Inclusion Task Force as the liaison officer. And right now our focus as part of, this is a ADHO, Alliance of Digital Humanities Organizations, instituted body that actually asks us to create non-normative conversations around DH, acknowledge them and take it. Very proud to be part of this. And please let us know if you have any particular thoughts on equality, diversity, inclusivity in DH spaces. And that's where I would like to end today. And thank you for your time. I realize I went a little ahead more than I should have, but yeah, that's me.
Thank you so much, Dibya. This was great learning for me, especially a digital humanities novice. I, however, have a few questions for you, if you would be so kind to respond. One of the questions you touched upon. So I wanted to know the ontology of a digital humanists, because we did discuss the ontology of digital humanities today. But what are the values a digital humanist, so to say, holds dear?
Right. So thanks, Akash, for that question. Let me be a little provocative and say there are no values that a digital humanist holds who a humanities scholar should not. So if you enter the field of digital humanities by saying, "Oh, I have a separate set of values from the humanist scholar," then don't come to digital humanities, because digital humanities scholar, and to now answer it more, on a serious note, a digital humanist scholar should not be a techno-positivist. By that, I mean that a digital humanities scholar should not look at fancy tools, techniques as a way of legitimizing their own narrative. They should rather look at technologies as a conversation partner with humans to answer questions that humanists should ask, and questions that have just changed the platforms. Right? In many ways, the politics of platforms is very, very integral. to the digital humanist, and the digital humanist should be aware of and acknowledge. So similarly, now when I'm sort of questioning the digital humanities scholar, I should also say, for example, book historians are make great digital humanists because they're very well aware that the conversation around the book is not just about the printed culture, right? The conversation around the book doesn't begin with Gutenberg's printing press. It begins far long ago. Although the book etymologically comes from birch, right? Bhurjapatra. For example, if you look at even writing as an idea, writing evolves based on the mediality of it. Or even if you take writing one step backwards and you think of writing as just an expression, human expression, um, many scripts are rounded because they were written on platforms or materialities that did not allow for uniform. So, for example, anything that's written on Bhurjapatra is much more rounded because otherwise the leaves would tear away. Okay. So, similarly, if you can't write more than 280 characters on a platform, that platform has limitations. So, now acknowledging that limitation is a value that the humanist or the humanity scholar should hold very, very dear. So yeah, in short.
And again, you spoke about this also, but I would like you to enumerate a little more. You did speak about how the digital space also has its inequities. We also understand how it entrenches the pre-existing social inequities. Uh, how does a researcher navigate around this conundrum? So to say that there is extractive capitalism involved in this entire practice. And then is a researcher a part of it or not? And how can we as a discipline, and I'm talking about digital humanities, be more critical about it? Your thoughts, please.
Right. So Akash, I think we have to go a few steps backward here again. Not backward, but few steps back. That any research project that is trying to extract does not belong to one discipline. It belongs to an entire school of thought. So the methodology that every researcher in the humanities and social sciences must use right now is a methodology of co-production, where the community that you are researching are, or the group of people, the texts, even if the texts that you're researching speak to you. So you need to listen as opposed to just deciding that this is what I want to do. So I think listening is the skill that I have learned. I don't think that it comes to us organically. We pick it up, but listening to individuals, listening to communities, talking to as many people as you can, and asking them to have a stake. So using the word impact in a far larger context than just your impact in a high impact journal publication. Impact is not about what is the what is the H index of your project, or what is the H index of that particular scholar. Impact means what does it do for people. And impact is often cannot be graded in terms of what you see right now, but what happens over a period of time. It's difficult. But no one said that research was something that gives you immediate results. So this kind of instrumentalization of humanities and social sciences is something that we have to actively fight against, and say that the goals of digital humanities, for example, why liberal studies matters so much, is if you take liberal arts as a discipline. Liberal arts is every discipline that doesn't professionalize. So, but it creates the foundation for professionalization. So, English, for example, is liberal arts. Journalism is vocational. Biology is liberal arts. Medicine is vocational. That means that there's a constant conversation. Not one is not better than the other, but one needs the other to survive and become better.
Absolutely, I agree with you there too. And also, Swati Moitra, one of our colleagues, is doing very good work in how rating systems work and so on and so forth. Uh, my next question has to do with us teachers, Sakshi, you, I. Uh, we can't possibly imagine a future without some bit of learning being digital or using digital techniques in our teaching methodologies and techniques. But as digital technology and digital culture emerges, how can we make our pedagogies more critical with or without media, with or without technology?
Well, that's a great question, Akash. And this is a question that I have a lot of investment in, because I have a lot of investment in DH pedagogies. And I feel that, and again, this is not an affective act of feeling, but rather something that I've seen, that the online space and the offline space both need to be encouraging of learning. That's fundamentally what we need to do. So we do whatever is required as pedagogues to encourage that form of learning. So if we do realize that a particular offline space, for example, a physical classroom, and I walk in there and I have 50 students, and I know some of them do not are not as comfortable with class participation as others. So for them, maybe, a discussion forum that allows them asynchronous pointing out of what they learned from the classroom is a fabulous space. On the similar hand, if there's a student who's based in a part of the country where you possibly cannot reach them at that point of time through a physical classroom, you create a hybrid classroom. And now I think COVID's done a lot of terrible things, but it's also shown us that there's this difference between availability and adaptation. A lot of these platforms like Zoom, like Google Meet, were all available pre-COVID, but we did not adapt it. And that adaptation is often, that's some kind of a mental block that exists within us. So I think we need to just say to ourselves that what enables the best pedagogy, and that's a critical question, right? What does pedagogy mean, right? Pedagogy is gendered, though of course it has the original roots of pedagogy are gendered, but the idea of pedagogy is not a banking, and this is of course Freire's fabulous work, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. It's not a banking model. Pedagogy means where I learn as much from my students as they learn from me. That does not take away the authority of the pedagogue, because the pedagogue comes in with lots of experience. But this is what I always feel, and this is maybe controversial, but I feel right now in the 21st century, the teacher is a fabulous curator of information. We are able to curate information, and like a museum, you walk into a museum and you're able to see the curator's thought and his efforts in producing or putting forward those specific artifacts that allow a person to learn. I think we are curators and facilitators of conversation. That's how I see the humanist as a pedagogue.
Dibya, I'm more of a traditional literature student still. And some of these new technological ideas are very fascinating for me, but they also act as a scarecrow. So I'm often scared that just like our reality is subsumed in the digital, would normal material space humanities department also be subsumed in digital humanities spaces, probably in metaverse? What do you think about it? What do you think about the future? Is it as bleak as I paint it to be?
No.
Yeah, my answer is also no, Akash.
No, my answer is anything that we don't know, we fear. So my answer is just get to know it. That will take the fear away. And of course, knowing also helps in being critical. I have of course, I work on algorithmic bias, so I'm very much well aware. With, for example, GPT-3 coming in, which is a very large language model learning kind of machine learning's gone a few steps further. You can just type a particular line. You can do this practice this today. Go on OpenAI. There's something called Playground. Type a sentence and it'll generate text for you. So in the near future, not in the near future, right now, there are platforms where your students can type in text and AI, gives you a paragraph back or an entire essay back. So what does that mean? That means we got to know these platforms as much as they do know it, because that's our job as a pedagogue. We've invested something and we need to know about it. So I don't think fear is the methodology or the ontology that we should use here. I think it should be always what we understand to be a critical utopia, right? What Tom Moylan talks about. Pedagogies are always critical utopias. They are places which we will never reach the perfect pedagogy, but the act of striving towards it is the process through which we make that difference. So yeah.
Yeah, while we are at it, very interesting question and interconnection of pedagogy and algorithmic bias we've been talking about. So I have two questions, Divya. So the first one is, so as a teacher, as someone who's relatively new to DH and the whole big tent as we call it, so sometimes I think one of the concerns, maybe not voiced by my students, would be, okay, so I'm going to do this, I have learned all this, but to what end? And since this generation is already a digital native, so few things which are scary for us or which are very fascinating for us are just another thing for them. So how do you kind of deal with that kind of questions in the classroom? How does what kind of pedagogy you would allow to like would you have to allow these kind of answers? And my second question is more specific, since you mentioned that you are working in algorithmic bias. So I'm very interested in the field. I did a little bit of playing around with Mid Journey, and it was wonderful, but also kind of, I would say, I was a little concerned. So I did this quick search on an Indian woman sitting in mustard fields reading a book, and then I did an English woman sitting in mustard fields reading a book. And what algorithm shows are two very stark realities, exactly what we see in real world probably. So my next question then is that how do we kind of deal with this kind of algorithmic bias? So of course I loved Mid Journey, I loved all the wonderful images that showed up for me. So these were the two questions, if you could interconnect them and kind of help me navigate through them. Thank you.
So I'll take the first question second, but I'll take the second question first,
Yeah.
which is that, yeah, I don't know the answer. Like you, I'm a researcher in this field. I know that the biases are there. For
Right.
example, there's a fabulous scholar called Joy Bolamwini, who's a
Mhm.
Ghanaian American scientist and just finished her PhD from MIT. She has this fabulous documentary that's come out called Coded Bias, where
Oh,
she points out how all supercomputers are unable to recognize the faces of Black women, and the kind of racial bias that gets coded in, because there's something called objective function optimization in an algorithm that gets. So basically, I understand from the limited. I'm not a data scientist, but from my position as working in algorithmic bias for a while now, if you feed an algorithm garbage, you will get garbage. So
right.
it's garbage in, garbage out. That's GIGO, that's how they call it. So
Mhm.
if you are feeding an algorithm which is understood to be a black box, and it's not a black box, right? There's humans creating algorithms.
Yeah.
We have not reached technological singularity where computers are writing algorithms as well. They're not.
Right.
It's humans who are writing algorithms. For example, GPT-3 has largely an English oriented generation of text. It can't do vernacular language because it's not being taught vernacular language, and that's a problem, and
Right.
that's something that we need to talk about,
Right.
right? So you are absolutely right. In fact, not only with Midjourney, even with something like DALI,
Ah,
which is the AI
yes.
that produces images, you have similar problems because
Yeah.
there is not enough diversity in that data. If
Right.
there's not enough diversity in how these large language models are being created, and that's exactly why we need people like you to come and point this out, and maybe people like all of us to
Right.
kind of come in and join that conversation and say that, well, this is really nice, I think it will come to the classroom for sure, but do we not talk about the problems? Do we not talk about the issues? And it's almost like I can't be arrogant enough or have my head under the sand to say, oh, I'm not going to acknowledge that as a humanist, because that's not what the humanities mean to me. But that would be my limitation, right? That would not be the limitation of the discipline or the space. So
Right.
I think it's challenging because by nature technology excludes.
Yeah.
Technology by itself, if you look at Teshni as an idea which is actually based in making,
Hmm.
technology excludes because, and this is a fabulous essay by Langdon Winner called Do Technologies Have Politics? Do Artifacts Have Politics?
Oh,
Right?
okay.
So he talks about this example of Robert Moses, who
Mm-hmm.
who who creates the one of the first cantilever bridges in Long Island,
Hmm.
and the bridge is created at a height so that public buses cannot go under that bridge, which means African Americans can't visit Long
Right.
Island
Exactly.
because African Americans use public buses and not cars.
Yeah.
So technologies can exclude. And by nature of it, that's one form of exclusion. Or the other form is exclusion when our social imaginary is being put forward. For example, we see this very powerful artifact, the nuclear bomb, and we say, oh, it's a man, right?
Yeah.
The nuclear bombs originators are fathers of the bomb. Similar rhetoric is coming for AI. We have fathers of AI.
And literature
right?
also, for example, father of English literature. So
So
not only technology, I think. Yeah.
So I think any powerful artifact due to the social imaginary of maleness being given more power, which is based, of course, in actual facts, gets. So there are two ways. One is where technology is built to exclude, like the example of Long Island or the Long Island Bridge that I pointed out, and the other one was possibly the example of the bomb. And because I've now realized why I've moved from nuclear bombs to AI as my transition, because they are both apocalyptic technologies. Both of we have a belief they'll either save or create the world, right? So yeah, and sorry, the second question was about when you teach students certain platforms, they ask the question, what do you do with it? So I think that's a great question. I don't think that's a question only for the digital humanities classrooms, actually, to be honest. For example, when we teach a student communicative English in a first year course, they might ask you, what is the use of writing this précis? And then you realize that, oh, the précis doesn't, for most of your life, you'll be writing emails if you're in the knowledge economy. So you know how to write short. So that's a question that I am on the path as well as you to answer. But I would like to believe that enabling our students is the thing that teachers do. So to enable our students to navigate this knowledge economy, and which is problematic, of course, but to give them the tools, and tools might be a reductive word, but to give them the infrastructures, let me put it this way, to acquaint them with the infrastructures that allow them to negotiate the realities around them, is something that I do. And I'm very transparent about it. And I'm tell them that if I'm using Twine to help you create a story, right, or interactive fiction, I know you will never create this ever in your life, probably again. But if you choose to, you have platforms available. If you decide, for example, the platform I showed you, the story of Dalit individuals during the pandemic. We use Story Map, which is a Knight Foundation Northwestern University product, and that platform is open source, so therefore open access rather. So my students were able to use it to tell their stories. And I'll just end on this note that stories are very important to me, and I think to the humanities as well, because there's this business school professor in the US, Brené Brown, who says stories are data with a soul.
Yes.
So I have a lot of faith in that kind of conversation.
Right. Yes. So just one last quick follow-up question to the same thing. At one point, you also talked about work. I think you were talking about Rupikarism and decolonizing art. So it's very interesting for me to kind of dwell on this question, especially in terms of AI, because I have had very limited experience, but based on what I have been observing with whatever little experiments I've done. So how do we kind of then engage in digital humanities in the way that, while being aware of the technological bias or its exclusivity or its exclusion of people or communities, we can also still continue to kind of vouch for the causes that are important for us. For example, decolonization, right? And it's a huge term, and it's of relevance not only to digital humanities but for literature scholar or history scholar for that matter. So how do you kind of bridge the gap between two? So while on one hand we are saying, oh, I'm using technology to kind of talk about decolonizing art, but at the same time I'm also aware of the pitfalls. So what would be some of the ways in which, as a scholar, we could, what are some of the directions we could look at?
So just to point out, that project was basically about showing the problems of algorithmic interpretation. So what we did was, we chose, British Council gave us a certain selection of artifacts, and we did a blind kind of, not by blind I mean we asked our team to respond to those artifacts that spoke best to them. And once a sample was created from that population, we basically asked our team members three things: theme, emotion, and I think it was theme, emotion, and possibly kind of what you see as what is the effect of this, and the humans responded in a certain way, and then we passed those same artifacts through Google Vision API, and Google Vision interpreted that through its own manners. And on this particular app, what we are doing is a visual Turing test. We put out that app, and the audience is able to choose which is the human response and which is the algorithmic response. So the algorithmic register and the affective register are put into conversation to exactly the effect that you've pointed out, right? To point out that algorithms are fabulous things to look at because they allow us to process unbelievable amounts of data.
Right.
But some of them have brilliant, the effect of that is very emancipatory. But let's imagine if an AI based chatbot is being used in the health sector, and you are basically trying to answer certain questions, or medical professionals are very stretched, so we are trying to help them by creating an AI based chatbot that can respond to them. Now we also have to ensure that that AI chatbot is fed data, or it's is created or through data sets that are diverse enough. And that's true, Sakshi, for any methodology. As a qualitative researcher, you know that as an ethnographer, when they do participant observation or they do focus groups, every methodology has limitations.
Right.
And that's part of and close reading. The reason why no one talks about close reading as a methodology is because we do purposive sampling. We decide that if we are looking at the life of the Bengali immigrant in the UK in between the last 100 years, we decide to choose 5 books to write our essay or write our dissertation. We've done purposive sampling. We have read enough to know, be subject matter experts, and we've chosen from a population of million texts 5 texts that speak to us. With distant reading, we could have chosen that million texts, but of course the limitation would be, in both there are limitations. In one, the limitation is breadth, right? The other, the limitation is depth. So I think in some cases, acknowledging the limitations and saying, oh no, this is the perfect methodology, that I think is just being blind to what the limitations are. So yeah, I'm all for limitations and limitations of
limitations are good.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant.
Right. Okay. Akash?
Thank you so much, Dibya.
I'm
still learning, but one last question, perhaps. We are living in a post-truth age. There's a cacophony of information. You mentioned 1 billion sites. Not all of them can be trusted. Not all of them are authoritative. As digital humanists, how do we advent this new age? What are the challenges we face? What are the challenges we fight?
Great question. And I think you have a scholar slash technologist coming to your conference, Tarunima, who will be able to speak more to this. But Tarunima's organization, Tattle, has just created a Chrome extension called Uli, which I would strongly recommend, that is actually able to kind of create filters for offensive, problematic, fake news-ish, or something that can be understood to be hate on social media. So I think the only way to acknowledge and create that is through trying to know more, trying to converse with more people. These are realities. Fake news, misinformation, disinformation in its various forms, online cyber trolling, hatred, abuse. But that's exactly where we need to come in. There's wonderful work going on, which is one of our colleagues who was earlier at Microsoft Research, Joyjit Pal. Joyjit does quite a bit of work on fake news. And there's many scholars who are working on this, who are looking at the importance of questioning these platforms, their methodologies, and the way they kind of often enable fake news to become more normative. And I think the fact that we are able to question this now is a good step. And the fact that digital humanities allows us to become stakeholders in this conversation. And I think stakeholders and conversations are 2 words, along with community, that I really hold dear.
Absolutely, can't agree more. Thank you so much, Dibya. Sakshi, please.
So I'll just have one last question to kind of bring everything together. So since you know that our conference is just now around the corner, and we coming from a very research oriented mindset, like at liberal studies we are trying to do a lot of research, and that's why DH is also one of the parts of that attempt, that endeavor. So what is your probably take on how digital humanities and research can come together for a new school, and what can be the major takeaways for us from this conference and initiatives like this, and what would be a few things that you would want to kind of us to remember as we move forward to trying to engage with it, trying to learn from it.
Right. So, Sakshi, I'll take the other way in answering that by saying is that if I tell you, then I will be actually kind of going contradicting my own
Right.
argument. So, I think the research should emerge from the place that you are working in.
Right.
So, and I do have a kind of not problem, but I do believe that DH has the only signified for DH has often been research. And by that, I mean that DH research that works on pedagogy as well is as good research as you can think about, right? So the questions that you've asked today, for example, how do we use digital platforms in the classroom to ensure that our students are better prepared for the current knowledge economy, attention economy is a great research question. Right. Or if you ask the question that Akash points out, that how does fake news, misinformation and disinformation create platforms for the humanities scholar to dwell on, and what are the ways through which you do this? These are also research questions, and not also, but these are the research questions that we need to think about. But I would say the fact that you are able to think about research, pedagogy and community in kind of conversation with each other is a very important pointer, and that's what I try to model in my own work, that I do not see myself as only a researcher or only as a pedagogue or only as a person who does community outreach for DH. I see these three things in conversation with each other, right? So that's what I would say. And it's to be honest with you, research also requires resources.
Yes.
And that requires support. And I think from so far what I've seen, you seem to have that support. So I congratulate UPES on getting this together, and I hope to have this conversation in person soon.
Yes, and we hope to have you here for the next conference.
For sure.
Yeah. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much,
Fingers
Divya.
crossed.
It has
For
been
sure.
an
Thank
absolute
you.
delight and privilege to have you here.
Thanks.